Before we begin this podcast, please be advised that the following episode contains language that some listeners may find offensive and inappropriate. The opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not reflect the views of the podcast producers. Listener discretion is advised.
This week on Voices of a Killer, we look at a chilling murder case in the outskirts of St. Joseph, Missouri. Over the 4th of July weekend in 2015, Buchanan County Police forcibly entered a home in the quiet neighborhood and were met with a grisly scene. An elderly couple had been shot several times, their bodies then discarded nearby. With no signs of forced entry, suspicion quickly turned to the third occupant of the home, the couple's teenage grandson, Joseph Johnson. Not much was known about the family, who kept out of sight of their neighbors. But as the investigation unfolded, it dug up unsettling details about what had really gone on behind the closed doors of their home. Today, we're joined by the killer, Joseph Johnson, to tell his never-heard-before story. For the first time since his conviction, Joseph tells the public why he killed his grandparents at 16 years old, an act he now deeply regrets. Joseph's case bears striking similarities to that of high-profile killer Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a topic we'll discuss at length in this interview. Throughout, we'll hear Joseph's allegations against his grandparents and the suffering and isolation that pushed him over the edge. So join us for a story of repression and violence with a complex teenage killer at its center in this exclusive interview with Joseph on Voices of a Killer. Joseph, did you grow up in Missouri?
I did.
Where at?
Bouncing around mostly, but usually in the northwestern quarter of the state, around Kansas City.
Yeah, you say bouncing around. The first thing I thought of whenever you said you lived with your grandparents is bouncing around. How come you didn't live with your parents?
Honestly, the easiest way to get to the core of that is to say that my father couldn't stand the sight of me and my mother was in no shape to.
Why would your father not like the sight of you?
In his own words, he said, "You look like your mother, you make me sick."
How's that feel, you're having your father say that about you?
At the time, I was so enamored of the kid that, I just wanted his approval, but I think a lot of my crime was misdirected anger towards him and a lot of my personality, really.
Do you forgive him for not wanting you?
I don't forgive him, and in my experience, I don't think forgiving has the healing powers that people do, but I live with it in a healthy way. I don't dwell on it.
Do you think you dwelled on it as a little kid whenever he said that to you?
I think I kind of repressed it in a way, and I think I channeled it into my homeschool. I thought if I could be smart enough or good enough, then maybe he could love me.
And what do you think the reason is, if you were to guess? Do you think it really is because you look like your mother?
I think it's because he had me when he was a young man. He wasn't ready, and I think my mother was a convenient excuse, and he blamed me for his loss of childhood, ironically, which resulted in the loss of mine.
How old were you in your childhood whenever you found out he didn't want you?
Almost immediately. I've never lived with him. He was only a visitor, a holiday guest that just seemed to have no qualms about making it known.
Yeah. And then now you say your mom wasn't fit. Was she drugs, alcohol, abuse, or depression, or what?
Well, to hear her tell it, it was bipolar depression. To hear other people tell it, it was drugs, opiates, pills.
So I guess that forced you to live with your grandparents. Was that your mother's grandparents or parents, or your dad's parents?
I actually lived with both. My mother's parents, but unfortunately she wound up dying of cancer, and her husband had no relation to me, and I eventually bounced to my father's grandparents.
So with that being your father's grandparents and you living there, did your father ever come around to see his parents and you were there?
Yeah, like I said, holiday visits. The longest was about a 1-year stretch when he lived with us because he had gotten a girl pregnant and moved her in and had the child and then moved out.
The same house that you lived in?
Yes.
So you lived with the grandparents, and that was Dad's parents, but he had to actually kind of go back to them for a little while, and you
live there with him, the same dad that said he didn't want you?
Even worse than that, we were all under the same roof, and
Yeah.
they actually pulled me out of my room for him to live in my room.
Okay. So you got displaced so he could live there.
Yeah.
How did that feel with him living there and you know that's your father and he doesn't want nothing to do with you?
It felt bad. At first, I was just kind of glad to have him around because I was homeschooled, so obviously if there's a certain emotional immaturity that comes with that because of how isolated my social life was. But what really stung was that he kept my brother, my half-brother, and I think that had a more negative effect than anything.
So he favored your half-brother that's on his side, his other son.
I am the only child my mother or my father didn't want. They've both since kept their children since me.
So, and you realized that you were rejected at that young age, didn't you?
Yes.
To Joseph Johnson, the idea of having a loving mom and pop felt like a distant dream. Early on, Joseph's parents abandoned him in the hands of his grandparents, a stinging rejection that set the tone for the rest of his childhood. Joseph's mother, who battled bipolar and opiate addiction, was clinically unfit to care for her son. And in their rare interactions, Joseph's dad openly expressed his disdain for Joseph, making cruel comments and blaming him for the loss of his bygone youth. With time, both of Joseph's parents forged new families with new children, solidifying the fact that they had no room for Joseph in their lives. Around the time he turned 13, Joseph was placed under new guardians. He was taken in by his 70-year-old paternal grandparents, who lived out in the St. Joseph surrounds. As you head northwest out of the city, paved streets give way for bumpy dirt roads and densely packed buildings open into stretches of farmland. It was out here, in an upmarket Buchanan County neighborhood, that Joseph's grandparents lived in their 10-year-old home at the end of a dead-end street. Before long, Joseph discovered that this new living situation gave him more stability, but it only deepened his feelings of loneliness. Joseph's grandparents were cold and unwelcoming and locked behind the steel gate that marked off the property, and Joseph felt like an outsider who didn't belong.
Around the same time, I realized my grandparents didn't really either, which was about 13, 14.
How did that affect you? Did you have these moments where you just sat alone and cried, or did you have outbursts where you committed crimes? What'd you do?
I was always alone. Like I said, I was homeschooled, and I was severely isolated in the country. I only left the house about 6 hours a week. I was in charge of my own learning. So I was majority alone. I had stopped crying, and I was more just a simmering, angry kid at that point. And I did shoplift, but there was really no avenue for me to commit worse crimes than that.
It seems like the better idea would have been to actually put you in some type of school around a bunch of other kids, since your, grandparents didn't really want nothing to do with you, your dad, your mom, yet they isolated you even more, probably making it even worse. Did you feel like that?
It did, and I actually had a theory when I was 11 about why this was.
Let's hear it.
Every child that my grandparents had raised was a miscreant, basically, my father being the worst one. And I felt like they thought that if they latched the discipline down even farther, they might prevent this mistake from happening one last time.
So you got a whole bunch of discipline because of what's happened in the past. What was something that was very strict that they did to you?
My room had no door on its hinges. My internet was strictly monitored, basically a random bag check type situation. Everything I bought, everything. I mean, there was really no facets where pure surveillance and invasiveness wasn't a factor. I mean, very sheltered.
What town was this?
This was when I was living in St. Joe, and I was between my teen years.
Yeah. What age were you whenever your crime got committed?
I had just turned 16.
Wow. 16. So, and that's also, 16-year-old boy, that's also where things start changing and you probably start becoming a little more aggressive and things like that. Did you start to kind of have some backlash towards your grandparents on some of the things they were wanting you to do?
I had said no to them at one time in my whole existence, really. And my grandfather, who was really skinny as a whip, picked me up and threw me across the room, which is was a very unusual emotional outburst for him. They were very apathetic, cold, and reserved. So I learned from that one time never to say no.
So you basically stood your ground one time with them, and he just come unglued and picked you up and threw you, and you never saw that?
Yeah.
Was it a pretty big surprise?
It would surprise people now because I got real skinny after prison, but I was 250 pounds then, and I was probably 14 at the time, and my grandfather was half that weight, and he picked me up and threw me, and it was amazing that he could even do that to me.
Wow. What would you say no to?
It was something so trivial I had long forgot about it.
Yeah.
I think it was some menial chore.
Right. You just said no, and he reacted pretty quickly. Did it scare you?
Honestly, yeah, it terrified me.
Yeah. The time that your grandfather snatched you up, was she right there?
She was.
Did she kind of feel bad for you? Because she probably saw the frightened look on your face when he snatched you up. Did she try to, what was her reaction?
Pure anger. I mean, she really probably didn't support the overt violence of it because she was a settler woman in those areas, but I definitely didn't get sympathy. And I think an important thing to actually comment on that dynamic is that of the two of them, my grandfather was actually scared of my grandmother.
Really?
Yeah. It kind of sounds silly to say out loud, but I used to say that it was like being raised by a snake in a bowl. She still had the power to bring him down if he absolutely needed to be.
Really? That's interesting. So he pretty much did whatever she wanted him to do, and she, kind of bowed down to her.
Yeah, she really wanted to assert herself.
Did you get much hugs and love from your grandparents?
No, they were very cold people in general.
Yeah. I noticed some families that work like that, because my family is completely opposite, very touchy. We hug and stuff like that. And so other families are distant, What's up?
Since being in prison, I've gotten a lot of chances to educate myself in a lot of areas. And I find that and talking to other people who have murders, that it's often mother issues, and especially lack of affection from mothers, that is a very common thread.
Sure. Do you feel like you definitely lack that mother?
I do. I've come to a point where I don't regret it so much, but yeah.
Joseph called his grandparents the bull and the snake, a snide look into their jarring personalities. His grandfather, the bull, was all brute strength and anger, the enforcer of rules who wouldn't hesitate to strike Joseph. But it was the snake, Joseph's grandmother, who pulled the strings, manipulative and quietly keeping a tight rein on the house. Under his grandparents' roof, Joseph's life was tightly controlled. Fearing that their grandson might follow in the footsteps of his troublemaker father, Joseph's grandparents knuckled down on discipline, adopting an authoritarian style of parenting. Constantly, Joseph was subject to surveillance and invasions of his privacy, his internet usage monitored, his belongings picked through, and his bedroom door taken off its hinges. Trying to fend off outside influences, Joseph's grandparents chose to homeschool the teen, which left him severely isolated. Above all, Joseph remembers his grandparents' Hurlingen Road house to be a cold and distant place where he was deeply alienated from those responsible for caring for him. Painfully devoid of affection and now trapped like a prisoner in his new home, Joseph tells me he became a quote-unquote simmering angry kid. As the years rolled on, Joseph's resentment towards his grandparents grew and grew without an outlet.
I resented him and my grandmother, yes, but honestly, it was more just fear.
So you feared them?
And most definitely.
Did you fear your grandmother physically too?
Yeah, actually, looking back on it, in an actual numbers game, she actually wound up hitting me and striking me more than he ever did.
At what age did your grandmother hit you first?
Right, honestly, couldn't remember that far back. It's been longest.
Was it before 10 years old?
Yeah, safely, I can say, yeah.
Okay. And how would she hit you? Upside the head or grab you? Was it pretty physical beats over and over again or what? You
know the old stereotype about the grandmother with the wooden spoon, right?
Sure.
Well, I mean, it was often just objects, wooden spoons, rolling pins, getting upside. As I got older, it came to full-on just getting cuffed upside the head, punched. And an important thing that I would like to make the distinction of is that the homeschool thing has to be held prevalent here. These days, I wouldn't call that abuse. I've met people that have gone through very serious abuse. But being in such isolation, never leaving the house to interact with other children, that abuse, quote-unquote, seemed so magnified that it seemed like the worst thing in the world to me.
Yeah. So there is degrees to abuse, obviously, but also whoever's the recipient of the abuse, it's kind of their decision on how much that affects them. Everybody's different. So it may be mild abuse, but for you, it might be psychologically very damaging compared to someone else. I would assume. I think I've heard that before, said before by a psychologist or something. There's a couple, I don't know if you watch the news in prison, but there's actually a bunch of stories out there. Some of them are different, obviously, than, there's not a carbon copy to yours, but these parents that are like, they're really strict parents, they're actually really good parents, except that they're doing extreme things that are actually, defined as abuse. As far as tying their kids up and shit and punishing them by not letting them eat and things like that. Did you ever get that kind of stuff?
There was a few occasions where I was locked outside the house. I remember sleeping in leaves and things like that, but I think abuse is a way broader category than people think. For example, a handful of years ago, I had the great honor to have a correspondence with Gypsy Rose. I don't know if you're familiar with her case.
I've talked to her before.
And she actually had a very interesting take on abuse in at least her conversations with me, and it was basically anything that could hurt.
Sure. Yeah. So do you feel like every time that was happening and you couldn't, express yourself or defend or talk back, that you were just getting repressed more and more?
Yeah, it was like, I'd even go so far to say it felt like oppression. Like it felt to me like pure tyranny because I had absolutely no options or choices in most of the things.
Joseph's grandparents ran an oppressive household where Joseph's every move was surveilled and dictated. But although he lived in constant fear of his grandparents, Joseph hesitates to call his experience abuse. Years later, Joseph would share a similar sentiment when he stood trial for his crime. Taking the stand, Joseph apologetically told the courtroom that he had mistaken discipline for abuse. There's a thin line between harsh parenting and abuse, and it's a line disciplinarian parents often straddle. To take a definition from the United States Department of Health and Human Services, child abuse constitutes any failure by a caretaker that leads to a child's emotional or physical harm. I'm no expert, but it's possible that the strict discipline Joseph endured ticks some of the boxes of this definition of abuse. Joseph was stripped of his right to privacy and dignity, kept willfully isolated from others, and deprived of any agency over his life. All this was exacerbated by his homeschooled upbringing, which gave Joseph no release valve from the intense control he faced at home. While Joseph's household felt rigid and unkind, he still assumed that his grandparents had his best interests at heart and would never put his well-being at risk. After the break, we hear an incident that made Joseph question whether that assumption still rang true.
Did you ever react to your grandmother? You said the one time that you reacted, and that's whenever your grandfather snatched you up or whatever. There was no other time?
There was no other time, no.
You were 16 when this murder occurred?
Just about a month into being 16.
Where were you at in your head around that age of being 16? So you're only a month into it. So tell me about your birthday. What'd you do for your 16th birthday?
I honestly couldn't tell you. Most of the days like that were a blur, but I will tell you an incident that within that few months that really solidified for me that not only did they not love me, in my view, but also I started to hate them. And it was, I had what has been described to me since then as a seizure. I don't know the accuracy of that. But I was getting out of the shower, and I started to feel horrible. And my vision started to white out, and like my heart was beating out of my chest, and I thought that I was dying. Very seriously, and I had stumbled out naked and had asked for help, and that I think I need to go to the hospital or whatever. And they just kind of yelled at me and told me to get on. And I had went to the hallway, and I had fallen in the hallway, and I had whited out. I guess I had been laying there for quite some time, because about 10, 15 minutes had passed. And after that, I genuinely felt like they didn't care if I lived or died. Neither did they come and even check on me.
That was kind of like a turning point right there where something serious medically happened to you and they brushed it off.
Yes.
Did you really kind of get into yourself and into your head after that? You just kind of, the anger just was just really there?
Absolutely. And as I've already mentioned, the homeschool thing can never be understated, because especially with people that are as quiet as them, my mind only had itself for a reference. And a teenage going through a hard time, your mind just eats itself.
So that's funny. Your mind is its own reference. And then you have grandparents that are basically, it's almost like you're a burden to them and they're just going through the motions and, and real strict. That's, I think if anybody listening could put themselves in that position, it'd be very difficult. And it sounds like a turning point came with this medical thing. Did you ever figure out what happened to you, why you blacked out like that?
It happened a few times since then. The best theory I've heard is that it's some type of a seizure, but I haven't had it in years, so I honestly couldn't tell you.
You know substances involved?
No, I've honestly never done anything in my life. A couple of things that come to prison, but for most of my life, no drugs. Obviously, because of the homeschool, I'm a virgin. No alcohol, meth, nothing.
You went to prison a virgin?
Yes.
And what's your sentence?
2 life sentences, but with recent law changes, they have to at least see me for parole in 2030 to decide if they can let me out earlier.
As Joseph neared his 16th birthday, his daily life was one monotonous blur, an indication of how emotionally numb he'd become. However, there's one incident that stands out sharp and clear in Joseph's mind. Joseph describes a medical scare, similar to a seizure, that struck him while he exited a shower one day. Although Joseph called out for help and collapsed in the hallway, his grandparents showed no concern. Despite the danger Joseph could have been in, they ignored their grandson with cold indifference. This marked an inflection point in Joseph's relationship with his grandparents. It served as proof that, although his grandparents were the caretakers who fed and clothed him, they didn't truly care if he lived or died. To Joseph, it exposed his grandparents' true colors, reinforcing his understanding that they were ambivalent towards him at best. After this, Joseph's anger towards his grandparents festered, and this incident became the catalyst for a dangerous new thought that entered Joseph's mind.
So, let's back up a little bit back to this time that you had the seizure. How long before the murder was that seizure?
A few months, give or take.
A few months. And were you doing homeschooling at that time?
Yeah, almost my whole life.
Yeah, but I mean, you were in session though, that you were actively doing it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was pretty much left in charge of my own education. So as much as a session meant to me, doing my own thing.
So you said that you were also out in the country, just isolated and everything. Did you ever come across anybody through social media where you could get away and see a girl or, go hang out with a guy or anything?
Strangely enough, I had a very lack of imagination in using it, but there was a girl. We went through a breakup, and there was another girl that came after that. And obviously this was a very charged time, and she had actually, because I had done one of my teenager runs, I could just kill them, and she had said, well, why don't you? And that was also a turning moment, because it hit me then that it might actually be an option.
So what did she say?
She basically just said, well, why don't you?
Why don't you what?
Kill them.
You told her that you were thinking about killing him?
Yeah.
And how did that make you feel hearing her kind of, confirm that?
To have something like become an option to you, and I tell people, especially new people in here, because I help some people like to deal with their traumas coming in here, like when they're a wreck, and I tell them like, okay, this is forever going to be an option for you. That's something you have to live with and adjust with. And that was a big transition for me.
Yeah. So this girl that told you, why don't you do it? Did you kind of in your head say, you know what, that's right, I should do it?
Yeah, I mean, that was essentially like 2 + 2 moment.
Did you tell her, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this?
I did, actually.
What was her reaction to you confirming it?
She didn't seem to have any problem with it whatsoever. It was very bizarre. I've still yet to figure out where her headspace was.
Yeah. Did she kind of encourage more than just agree? Did she kind of help you plan or anything?
She was honestly kind of just an impartial observer. Like, she was almost like really just like a camera. Like, it was following me around. Like, not really input, but was willing to listen to what was going on.
Yeah. So she was your sounding board. Did you tell her about planning it and stuff like that? Did you get as far as, hey, this is this day and all that?
Well, I mean, there was no real plan, but yeah, she was there for most of the train of thought.
Did y'all have multiple discussions about it?
Yes.
Do you think she was kind of intrigued at the fact that you might kill your grandparents?
Probably. I question sometimes whether she was just like a role play girl that like maybe was trying to live out a fantasy, but I really don't know.
And you never got a chance to have sex with this girl?
No.
So are you starting to think about ways you would do it?
In my head, there was really the only way because there was a whole bunch of guns through the house, so it seemed like a given that would be the method, although that's not necessarily how it worked out.
The guns, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever you were actually like getting things together, the gun and like kind of planning it at that moment, what kind of thoughts also besides planning it were you like, yeah, I'm probably going to go to prison for this, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway?
It felt, at the risk of sounding dramatic, it honestly felt like I was in a state of oppression and it wasn't enough to escape it. It was that I had to lash back or just get rid of the oppressors themselves. It was very like, I don't know if you could say it was a philosophical indignation or something like that, but it was very, I mean, like I said, you could call it dramatic.
Yeah. Did you ever start to get to where you were like mad and you said, listen, if they do anything tonight, I swear to God, if they try to pull any shit this night, that's when I'm doing it. Did you start telling yourself these kind of things?
No, actually, because I was being raised by people like that who didn't talk very much, all this other thing. There was a certain degree of subtlety to almost every interaction thing there, so I consider myself to be a subtle person, or like when I would steal things, shoplifting, I was a sneak thief. So the idea of a big dramatic outburst is, even to this day, very alien to me. So it was going to be one of those silent, don't see it coming things. But that was never a question for me.
So your house, that household is very, nobody really talks to each other much. Nobody really interacted with you much or anything, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it was being alone with a couple of caretakers, essentially.
Yeah, I can almost see that. It's very eerie for the child because the child just really likes, especially a little boy, he wants another little boy to hang out with and, you know, show things and experience things and just, you know what I mean? It's like, that's crazy. You were completely isolated. Not only that, but just, you know, no loving family, no mom or dad. That's awful.
Months after the medical scare, a dark seed of thought took root in Joseph's brain. He started to believe that the quickest way to free himself from his grandparents was to kill them. As these thoughts of murder turned in Joseph's mind over the coming weeks, what began as an angsty fantasy soon became a concrete plan of action. A key factor that strengthened Joseph's resolve was a conversation he'd had with a girl online. The girlfriend seemed to get a thrill out of talking about murder and encouraged Joseph to go ahead with it. The many conversations they had on the subject gave Joseph permission to take murder as a viable option. Another factor in all this was Joseph's homeschooling, which distorted his thinking. Stuck in total isolation and often left with only his thoughts to keep him company, Joseph was cut off from others and lived in a kind of echo chamber. Because of this, Joseph convinced himself that the only way out of his intolerable living situation was to eliminate his grandparents once and for all. Joseph had easy access to his grandfather's gun collection, so the means was readily available. And as he considered the logistics of the act, Joseph imagined not a dramatic outburst, but a quiet, calculated approach, something his grandparents would never see coming. The day before the 4th of July weekend in 2015, Joseph typed a text message to his girlfriend and hit send. It said, "Today is the day." Next time on Voices of a Killer, Joseph's murderous plans become a reality. If you want to find out what happens next, right now, you can sign up at patreon.com/voicesofakiller. There you can find bonus content, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community. So go to patreon.com/voicesofakiller to sign up now. Your support is what keeps us passionate about bringing these stories to you. That's a wrap on this episode of Voices of a Killer. A big shout out to Sonic Futures, who handled the production, audio editing, music licensing, and promotion of this podcast. If you want to hear more episodes like this one, make sure to visit our website at voicesofakiller.com. There you can find previous episodes, transcripts, and additional information about the podcast. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach new listeners. Thank you for your support, and we can't wait to share more stories with you in the future. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Toby, and we'll see you next time on Voices of a Killer.